furniture and make it more armored. He kind of covered his bald. They were worried about him being bald. Covered his bald head with the headpiece. And as far as green, the reason for green is because that was a choice made back in the '60s. I don't know if it was an art direction
Well, I
choice.
know exactly why.
Oh, tell me why in a second.
Okay.
But whatever the reason was, I decided to just like run with it on our show that green was going to be the color of evil. So even characters that didn't have green, like Craven, would make his eyes green. You saw in the clip with the enforcers, the laser beam is green, the net is green. Just trying to plant those kind of things that carry that over. And even at the school colors, since he's sort of being picked on by Flash and the football players, that the school colors they're gonna have green Letterman's jackets. Anyway, what's the reason they did in the comics?
Well, in comics back in the '60s, it was a three-color separation process, and so you needed colors that popped on the comic book page. And since Spider-Man was red and blue, the third color that pops is green. It's why the Hulk started out gray, and then they very quickly changed him to green, because gray on a comic book page, when not today. Today you can have all the colors in the rainbow and more. But back in the '60s, really all the way through the '80s, the early '80s, the color separation process was so relatively primitive to what we're used to today that for marquee characters like heroes and villains, you needed colors that really pop. And because Spider-Man was blue and red, they didn't want to make too many villains blue and red. So most of Spider-Man's villains have green elements to them, because green was the third. You'd think it was yellow because that's the other primary color, but in fact, yellow gets very pale on a pulp page. It gets absorbed in because the paper isn't exactly white. There's a yellow tint to it, but green pops. So that's why all those Spider-Man villains are green.
Green and red tend to be complementary colors. You see them as Christmas colors. So whatever the printing process reason, on this show, we decided to make it the color of evil for Spectacular Spider-Man.
And then regarding Rhino, you chose to go with Alexander O'Hearn instead of Alexei Sistovich. Is that for any?
Yeah, that was me. I just felt like I wanted Craven to be special, and Craven was Russian, and so having another Russian villain didn't. It felt like it would undercut Craven. Craven's Russianness seemed very essential to him, whereas Rhino's Russianness didn't. So I wanted to, and I know in the comics later they decided that the two guys were related, and I thought, well, that's kind of a big coincidence, and it was definitely a decision made after the fact. They weren't related initially, and so I like the idea of being able. I mean, if you watch the whole first episode of Spectacular Spider-Man, you meet 90% of our villains in that first episode before they become supervillains. So you meet Rhino and Sandman as these two sort of heist guys, these buddies that Spider-Man takes down, and they've got very different points of view. But I just like that idea of using the O'Hearn last name, which was also from the comics, and saving the Russian for Craven. Come on in. Other questions? Yeah.
What was Miguel Ferrer like to work with?
Miguel was just fantastic. We miss him terribly on Young Justice as well as in life. He was a great guy, very funny. Miguel's parents were Jose Ferrer and Rosemary Clooney, and so he had all these great stories about growing up in that sort of old Hollywood environment, and he was incredibly talented with this amazing voice. And he was not a big guy. He had this big voice with these deep chops, but he was not a big guy at all.
I see RoboCop, I know.
Yeah. So, but he, it really goes back to Mulan. You see the work that he did in Mulan, and just coincidentally, I happened to watch Mulan again the other night. It was just on Freeform or something like that, and I couldn't help myself. Mulan's so great. I just I was, flipping channels, and my wife and I, and we just stopped on Mulan and wound up watching the whole thing. And he's so good in it, and that really made us want to use him on Spider-Man. And then when it came to casting Vandal Savage for Young Justice, there was no one else.
And
Miguel.
same for us doing Stretch Armstrong and the Flex Fighters. We wanted him to be Stretch Monster for that same reason. It's fantastic.
And he worked almost right up until he passed. He stayed as active as he possibly could. And I'm good friends with his niece, and his family misses him terribly. It's really horrible, but that's life and death. More cheerful question?
Sorry about that.
That's okay. No, I'm happy to talk about Miguel. He was great. Yeah.
So, what do you think the potential chances are of the Spectacular Spider-Man being revived in some sort of like tie-in comic, versus the chances of the TV show, which seem to be very low?
Yeah, it's almost, and I'm a guy who's always sort of cheerleading for things coming back, whether it's Young Justice or Gargoyles or anything, but the legalities, again, and nothing to do with the creative, but the legalities of this, where Sony owns this version of Spider-Man and Marvel owns Spider-Man, and now Disney owns Marvel, and I mean, look, you never know. I mean, Spider-Man Homecoming was done by Sony. No, I take that back. It was done by Marvel, produced by Marvel for Sony. And Disney and Sony and Marvel all worked that out. So I suppose it's possible, but it's hard. It isn't easy. They'd have to be all these lawyers involved in this big thing. And so it's one thing to do that for a movie that they're hoping to make $1 billion profit on. For them to do it for a comic book or an animated series, my sense is that it's not worth it to them when they can just make a new Spider-Man series every few years, and they've got plenty of Spider-Man comics. So unfortunately, I don't think it's too likely for Spectacular, but I hope I'm wrong. I mean, I really hope I'm wrong, because we had a lot of plans and we'd love to do more Spectacular. It was one of the greatest work experiences of my career, such as it is, and I'd love to do more, but I can't see it happening. I do. I love Big Cook. I just adore this man. Most of the time. But unfortunately, I don't think it's likely. Any other questions? This will be very short. Yeah. No one? Really? All right, go for it.
I'm just gonna come out right now and say I share a birthday with Marina Sirtis, so I have to ask because you worked for Gargoyles, and I know that she was gonna be on Spider-Man. Is she just as nice in person as?
She was going to be on Spider-Man. Oh yeah, that's right. We were talking about her for Emily Osborn. If we had done a third season, yeah, she would have played Norman Osborn's wife. Marina is fantastic. She is a good friend of mine. She is very funny. She is very caustic. If it's funny because she played Deanna Troi, who is probably the nicest person in the entire Alpha Quadrant. She also played Demona for me and Queen Bee, and she's much more like Demona than she is like Deanna. And she will easily admit to that. Marina is funny and tough, and a tremendously great person, and incredibly loyal, and a good friend. And she's nice too, but she is tough. And I adore that about her. But yeah, she's great. Anyone else? We've got like,
Well, we mentioned
20 minutes.
some of the thoughts of Steve Ditko. He passed away this year, and looking back when we're making the show, after the first animatic, the first storyboard, it wasn't thought of as we're doing the storyboard, but as we're finishing it, it's like we put webs over the skyline, like Steve Ditko did in his comic books.
And I very much wanted the underarm webbing that Ditko put on Spider-Man. That was very important to me.
So we put that in, and then that led to, let's do the half Spidey mask, and it led to how we were going to do the Spidey sense, because in this clip that we did in 2007, we were still experimenting with, well, how fancy are we going to get with the Spidey sense. But by the time we put those webs in the background, let's just do what Steve Ditko did. And so I'm really proud that those things are there. And I'm kind of proud that we put at the end of the credits, because I didn't know we were going to do this necessarily at the time, but we made sure Steve Ditko's name was in those
And Stan Lee.
credits. And Stan Lee.
Yeah.
But Stan Lee's name was going to always be there.
Well, Stan was there as an executive producer. And then, of course, Stan came and did a voice for us, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
He played Stan. And came in, had his little cameo. Character looked like Stan, just like it was a big Marvel movie. He had a blast coming in. He said to me a couple times that Spectacular is his favorite animated Spider-Man. That I don't know if he says that to every other producer of the other animated shows, but it's always nice to hear. I haven't seen Stan in a couple of years, but he was great. He read my first novel and wrote a blurb for it on the back cover, and just had a great time coming in. And we were gonna, if we had done a third season, we were gonna keep cameoing Stan once a year in the show because he was so much fun.
Did you have a question back there? Yeah. I knew there would be a lot of attention on it just because it was Spider-Man. Did I think it was going to get this kind of attention and be remembered years later and pop up in Entertainment Weekly or these top 10 lists? No, I didn't. I was like very pleasantly surprised over the years over it. Maybe Greg knew, but
knowing isn't obviously I didn't know, but you hoped. I mean, one thing that we very consciously set out to do was try and create something that felt definitive. When you think of Batman the Animated Series, which is a very different show, but you think of that as like a definitive version of Batman. What Alan Burnett and Bruce Timm and all those guys did on Batman the Animated Series, you look back on that, it feels like, yeah, that's Batman. And we very consciously and or arrogantly and or naively set out to do the same thing for Spider-Man on our show. We had what we called the 4 C's. We wanted it to be classic, cohesive, coherent, but contemporary. And then we had a 5th C, which didn't actually begin with a C. It was iconic, but it had a nice hard C near the front. So we wanted you. So we had these 5 C's, and we really set out to create a show that would feel like that was the iconic, classic Spider-Man show, and yet very contemporary. So New York was much more diverse than the 60s version of the comic book was. They had cell phones, for starters, and so it felt contemporary, and yet we wanted when Rhino came on screen, or when J. Jonah Jameson came on screen, or when Mary Jo came on screen, you wanted the audience to feel like, oh yeah, that's Jonah. Yeah, that's Rhino. That's Mary Jane. And we wanted them to be easily identifiable as their characters, so that you got a real sense that, yeah, this is the Spider-Man that we fell in love with, the Spider-Man of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko and Stan Lee and John Romita Sr. And yeah, we had influences like Venom and other characters from lots of creators that came later in the game, but it was all filtered through that same desire to create something iconic. And one thing that led us to was that when in the comics, when Green Goblin was first introduced, was a big mystery as to who he was. And we talked a lot about how do we recreate that mystery when everyone had just seen this big multi-billion-dollar movie, Spider-Man, that reveals that the Green Goblin is Norman Osborn. So on the one hand, I wanted it to be spoilers, wanted it to be Norman Osborn, but on the other hand, I wanted to create a mystery around it. So we actually worked very hard to fool the audience into thinking that we had decided to make Harry the Green Goblin, and then reveal at the end of season 2 that no, in fact, it always was Norman the whole time. And the fact that Norman framed his own son as the Goblin, I thought was one of the things I'm most proud of in the show. That he actually twisted his own son's leg so that his son would limp. I thought was great. Yeah.
What did you guys like most about making this spectacular Spider-Man?
Oh wow! I gotta tell you, it's a difficult question. I After the show is all done, said and done, I love everything about it. I love the storyboarding, the animation. Um, we were going for a squash and stretch style of animation, so I'm really glad the animators pulled it off. I mean, at the time of working on it, I don't know how much I actually enjoyed it. As Greg would know, it was super difficult. It was like we felt like we had a compressed amount of time to try to like do a lot of work. Um, we mentioned how we had a lot of agreement before we went forward on actors and music and those kind of things. But as we're making the show, there's like still a lot of notes that we had to try to get everybody on board to do the show we wanted to do. So I love the way it turned out. At the time, I don't know how much I loved it.
I loved it at the time. I didn't love every minute of it at the time, but my favorite part of the whole process is the mix, the audio mix. That's when it all really feels like it's coming together. We mix the shows at a place called Advantage Audio in, I guess it's in Burbank, and that's when you've got the music and the sound effects and the dialogue and the Foley and all these elements coming together, and the picture is done or almost completely done. And
we call the retakes.
We call the retakes. All the corrections have been put in, and we've got it up on this giant screen as we're mixing the sound and finalizing the sound. And Vic came up with this brilliant idea that the pumpkin bombs would scream when they exploded, which I thought was genius. And all these little elements that all these talented people had done were all coming together. And so the 3 hours we spend mixing the show is the most fun for me. The second most fun thing is the voice records. That's where we had huge casts, so it took us about 4 hours to record a 22-minute episode. And we would bring, we wanted all the casts to work together, but we had sometimes, particularly toward the end, we'd have casts that were so big that we literally didn't have enough room in the recording studio at Studiopolis in North Hollywood to fit everybody. So we'd bring them in shifts. We'd try to get people together who had scenes together. And we had just, again, our cast was so much fun and so amazing. Guys like John DiMaggio played both Sandman and Hammerhead. John is one of the funniest guys ever. And Clancy Brown, who was playing Rhino, and Captain Stacy, and then Vanessa Marshall and Lacey Chabert and Alana Ubach and Josh LeBar, who played Flash Thompson, and Andrew Kishino, who played Kenny Kong. They were like this little comedy team. So we were just laughing constantly in the booth while we were recording that show. So that was my second favorite part. And the rest of it feels like work.
Well, I gotta say, half the time I couldn't really be at all of the records because I had to. The storyboards and the animation was just such a huge process. But as Greg's talking, there's a couple of things that I remember that I have pleasant memories about. It's like spotting the music for the shows with dynamic music partners.
Yeah.
Because they would come up with a theme for each villain or each character, each situation. Another thing
Well, and also spotting was fun because they wouldn't see the show before we spotted. So they would watch the show for the first time as we were spotting the show, and the reactions were great. It was like, okay, this is working because they haven't been in on it up to this point, and they're reacting exactly the way we were hoping people would react, and so that was also fun. And they're also the composers on Young Justice. We do the same thing. We don't let them see the show until they come in to spot it, so we get their honest reaction to it as we're watching.
And the other thing is, Greg had mapped out the story. It's intricate. Each episode stands alone, but there's pieces that connect to the others, right? But I came into the show wanting squash and stretch animation, but I also wanted long action sequences. I had come from working on shows where if we were long, the first thing that got cut were the action sequences, and it was like frustrating me. So I'm like, that's not going to happen on the show. And we decided early on not to make animatics. So when you have an animatic, it's real easy to see the link and cut it. We would have a guy time out the storyboard, and we'd see how long the show was, and we'd always be 2, 3, 4, 6 minutes long. And they'd put Greg and I in a conference room, and it's like we're playing poker with each other. What's going to get cut? And I'm like, it somehow worked out. I mean, we made the show we wanted to make. I think all this story things and the things that needed to run through happened, and some of the best and longest and greatest action sequences in a superhero show. So I'm really proud of it. So Grace, I remember that as being a fun thing. Yeah.
Short question. If you had a chance to go back and produce it again, would you want to do TV or feature-length animation? And then the second part is, how would you incorporate new technology into it? Is it going to be wearing a Fitbit?
Well, I'm partial to television myself. I mean, if someone said, "Yeah, the only way we're coming back is if we do it as a movie," I'm not going to sit there and go no. But to me, Spider-Man is a character that in comics there's an element of serialization to it. Long form's great. I'm not knocking it, but for me, the ability to do these episodes and run threads through them so that the whole thing sort of becomes this tapestry of a story with long arcs and that kind of thing. To me, you can only really do that on series television. You can do it. I mean, look, the Marvel movies as a whole do it, but that's a huge kind of investment. And mostly when you do a movie, it's beginning, middle, and end, and that's pretty much it. So if I had my preference, it would be to come back and do TV episodes again. But I'm not that precious about it. If someone said movies or nothing, I'd be like, movies, let's do movies. In terms of how we modernize the technology, I haven't given any thought to that whatsoever, just because,
Well, I think we'd incorporate smartphones.
Yeah, smartphones, obviously, and I don't think I'd go quite as far as they do on Homecoming, where his suit is created by Iron Man and has a lot of sort of Iron Man-ish specs to it. I enjoy the movie Homecoming, but to me, that's a little less classic Spider-Man. It makes sense in that sort of Marvel Cinematic Universe sense, but for Spider-Man as a character, I like to keep him a little more. I don't like to overpower characters. That's true on Gargoyles, Young Justice. Every show I do, I think it's often a mistake to give your character too much power because you kind of want to maintain that underdog feeling to the character. So I don't think I'd go that far, but certainly things like smartphones, anything that's part of modern technology, plus
Tweeting.
20 minutes,
G. Jonah maybe tweeting.
Yeah,
those kind of things.
And how Peter takes pictures, that kind of stuff. But Spider-Man's still Spider-Man. He's been, a breakout classic character since 1960, what, three, one, can't remember now, but I guess three, 1963. Um, and a lot of it is, try not to break what isn't broken.
So yeah, I agree about the serialization. So TV series would be great, but as a someone who's on the animation and visual side, the appeal to do feature is a bigger budget.
Yeah,
So
that's
you
very
could
true.
so you could visually pull off all his fantastic acrobatics. The backgrounds could move more. And you're going to see that, I think, in this new animated Sony movie coming up that there's already trailers for. It just opens up that we're on a TV budget. You're kind of a lot more limited. Yeah.
For both of you, what are some of the big differences between creating a show for broadcast and for a streaming service?
Wow. Broadcast, it's a lot of notes. We had a lot of people we had to negotiate with and a lot of different points of view. Uh, Early on, the choices we made, we were on board, but as we're making the show, there's just a lot of notes. We had notes from Sony, we had notes from Kids WB, and from Marvel.
And then later from Disney
and
XD.
later Disney XD. And
Hasbro.
And we had how we wanted to do. I'll tell you one little story about Flash Thompson. It's Flash Thompson's birthday party, and there's a picture of Flash when he's a toddler, where he's running from behind, and he's supposed to be bare bottom. And this is after we went to Disney XD, so it was approved at Kids WB and designed the storyboard. And at Disney XD, the note was, well, you can't have him be bare bottom. And we kind of were like going crazy about this because story-wise, he's called Flash. And
Yeah, and also, it was from behind. It was just a little kid's butt. It just seemed like ridiculous.
so we were going sort of. He was really upset.
I was really
upset. And
I really was.
And our line producer just said, like just place a daisy like right there. So we kept him bare bottom and just covered his crack.
And that worked.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean,
but I was gonna say, but for streaming, the notes process is they at least, I don't know how it's going to be as it evolves, but say on Stretch Armstrong and the Flex Fighters, we pitched them up front the show and how we wanted to do it, and they saw who we were, and they kind of just like let us make the show. They want to see what we were going to do, whereas on the broadcast things, like I said, so many different
yeah,
points of view.
at the moment, streaming is still kind of the Wild West, and they tend to give you more freedom. But the truth is that we can literally see that changing before our eyes. That as these streaming services get bigger and bigger, they hire more and more executives, and the executives have to justify their jobs by giving notes. Otherwise, why are they there? So I don't know if there's going to be any difference. I mean, one difference right now, for example, between Young Justice season 3 and Young Justice seasons 1 and 2 is that when we were on Cartoon Network, we had broadcast standards and practices that would do things like say, you've got to put a flower in front of Flash Thompson's butt. On our streaming service, if I started doing it pornographic, I'm sure someone would come in and say stop. But we're definitely PG-13 toward R on Young Justice season 3, and no notes no S&P notes at all on the show, other than our own standards, personal standards, and that's been nice, giving us that freedom. But again, I don't know if that will change as time passes. It feels like it's already starting to change a little.
Yes, it pertains to the action question, or your action thing. So if the action sequences run a little too long, would you be speeding it up in animac or just cut the sequence?
No, you'd save like the best part. Let's say we did an action sequence that was like 3 minutes long. Let's say on a show that wasn't Spectacular Spider-Man, it may get cut down to like 10 seconds. And just keep the bare minimum of story. But on Spectacular Spider-Man, we didn't do that. We wouldn't keep the whole 3 minutes, but it'd be like 2 minutes. Some of it would be speeding things up. Some of it would be, we'd find other places to compress press or cut.
Right. I mean, there was a whole subplot about Betty Brant and Ned Lee. It just worked out that every time we got to Betty and Ned in an episode, the episode was long, and we just kept cutting Betty and Ned because they were. It didn't involve Peter that much. You know, Peter's sort of the center of the show. Everything revolves around him, and the Betty Ned subplot, which was fun, was just kind of off to the side and didn't really involve Peter. So anytime something was long, it was like, all right, there goes Betty and Ned again. And it was a bummer, actually, because Andrew Cascino played Ned Lee, and Gray Griffin, who back then went by Gray Delisle, played Betty, and they were both great. Their scenes together were great, but it just worked out that it always wound up getting cut because it just wasn't enough. It didn't involve Peter enough. And so, you know, we'd lose little bits of things here and there, and, you know, we would trim action sequences, but we wouldn't lose them, and we wouldn't cut them down to the bare minimum. We had, Vic is right, I don't think I've ever seen a show with the great and lengthy action sequences that Spectacular Spider-Man has.
The promo we showed in 2007, by the way, in the rooftop, that actually went on and on. The storyboard artist decided to have the helicopter take off, and all this stuff happened. Anyway, I loved it. Obviously, it was too long for the promo, but we kept remembering it, and we wrote it into the prologue of I think our season 1 ender. So you see the whole thing. It's about 2.5 minutes long.
So you able to move stuff around them, make use of it. Awesome.
How long would an episode usually take to make?
Wow. I'm going to say, let Greg talk about the beginning of script to record. But after the show is recorded, I would say it would take about 9 to 10 months. So we take about 5 to 6 weeks to storyboard it, and then another couple of weeks to time it, to design it, and then once we have all the art direction and everything figured out, as far as what it's going to look like, how it's going to move, and the camera angles, we would have the animators work on it, and they take about 16 to 20 weeks to do their first pass animation in color. And then we get it back, it's not ready to go yet because we are doing 2 things simultaneously at that point. We're editing it to time because we'll still ship, like we'll talk about how the show is over, but we would always ship the show about 1.5 minutes over so we can still tighten it. So we're editing and tightening the show and also calling retakes because there's like mistakes that we got to fix. And then the fun part about what we're talking about, the music and the sound effects, that happens. So yeah, from finished script and record to being on TV, it's about 9 months. So from
Yeah, I mean, it depends what you're counting from. I mean, I started on Spider-Man. I got the job around Christmas 2006, I think, and went on a vacation to a dude ranch in Arizona with my family, and brought along these big phone book sized black and white reprints of early Spider-Man comics, like 8 of them, and just was reading, and it's all stuff I'd read before, but I was reading and taking notes and figuring out in my head the Spidey's arc for that first season. And as I said earlier, that arc that I came up with on that 1-week vacation to Arizona, with the exception of switching out Electro and Kraven, stayed the arc for the whole season from beginning to end. But we would then came into the office, and Vic was there, and Michael Vogel, who was our boss, and the writers would come in, and we would break the episodes down on index cards up on a big, huge bulletin board in my office, and we'd break them down in detail, and then I wrote them up as premises, and so we submitted 13 premises simultaneously to Marvel and Sony and everything. That annoyed people too. But for us, the whole season was so cohesive, that's how we had to do it. Because if they approved 12 out of the 13, you know, they didn't like episode 8 for some reason, well, that would mess up everything up. So it was important that they saw them as a whole. And then the writers would come in and we would break the stories in even more detail. And the writers would go off and write detailed beat outlines. They would come back. I would do a editing pass on them. Then give them out again to the executives. We get more notes, come back, give those those outlines and notes to the writers, including me. I was one of the writers. And we would get first draft scripts back. I would do a pass on that, send that out for notes. We'd get notes. I'd do a final pass. And usually that's all we had to do. But that process probably takes total about 6 weeks. And so, but that's like 6 weeks for the first episode, and then second episode's a week later, and a week later, etc. And then the record is 1 day. I mean, for every episode records in one sort of 3 to 4 hour session. And so I would say probably if you took the 9 or 10 months he's talking about, you're probably going to add another couple months there. So you're talking about a year total, more or less, for beginning to end.
And while you're making that first episode, you're really simultaneously making the other episodes. Like he said, 1 week after we start the storyboards for episode 1, we're literally next week starting the episode for episode 2. So you have all these things
overlapping and simultaneous. And so we talk about a sliding schedule. In other words, if the whole schedule is 10 months to a year, you've got to view it as a sliding schedule. So to get all the episodes done, you've got to think of that as that 10-month schedule plus 13 weeks or plus 12 weeks. And that's why it takes so long to produce an animated series, as opposed to, say, live action television series or something like that. Because it's not just about when can you get the first one done. And in particular for a streaming service where they like to dump multiple episodes, dump's the wrong word. Just dump the wrong, drop multiple episodes simultaneously. It's not about when it, like at least when it was broadcast, if the first episode was ready to go, the 10th one didn't have to be ready for the first one to premiere. But if you're on a streaming service, most of the time, they want a whole bunch of episodes ready to premiere simultaneously. So it takes even longer. You're looking at when is the last one ready, not when is the first one ready.
You just reminded me one of the reasons why the show was really difficult from a schedule point of view. I had been at Disney for 16 years before that, and it wasn't a streaming service, but you would have almost a season's worth of episodes sort of done on the shelf months before it would go on. So you had a buffer. When we started the show, we were going to air, was it February or March? When did we premiere?
No, originally fall of 2008.
Fall of 2008.
And I started literally just me in December of 2006. I don't know exactly when you came on, but it was early 2007.
Anyway, but my point is they picked the broadcast date, and it was literally maybe 8 weeks after we first got the animation back to call retakes. So everything had to go exactly right to make those air. It was so tight.
Yeah, it was very, very tight. I remember once we had a huge problem with color. Can't remember exactly what the problem was, but just suddenly we got all this animation back and everyone was colored wrong.
I know exactly the reason. They had switched the monitors out.
Oh yeah, that's right.
They had switched the monitors out. We had done our Comic-Con promo in the first 2 episodes on these monitors Sony had for years. And then they switched them out for these brand new Cintiqs, and the studio didn't calibrate the monitors. But when we look at the monitors, it looks right. What I mean by calibrated is somehow if you plugged it into a TV, it would look like different colors. And we didn't realize that until like the 3rd episode, because the first 2 episodes were sort of based on the original monitors. And so it was a lot of like fixing
last
color.
Minute, yeah. Desperate times.
Have you guys ever had like a
blow up like that for the transmission? What do you do in your studio to what happens on different kinds of TV to where can you share if you have any?
Well,
The worst thing was the last episode. When episode 26 aired, last episode of season 2. Literally, this is what I picture happening. I don't know this, but this is what I picture happening. The episode begins, and it's a big fight sequence with Spider-Man. And, Spider-Man usually quips, tells jokes and stuff during a fight, right? Well, he's silent through this fight. In fact, no one's grunting. The music is playing. The sound effects are all playing, but there's no dialogue whatsoever. And in that first sequence, you could almost believe that it was on purpose because it's just a big fight scene. Then you've got all these talking scenes with no dialogue as it aired the first time. And what I picture is when it was broadcast, some guy's leaning on a button and having a conversation with his buddy. And at some point, the buddy says, "How come those characters aren't talking?" And the guy looks over and he goes, "Oh, shit." And he takes his arm. And so for the last 5 minutes of the episode, the dialogue just cuts in. But for the first 18 minutes, there is no dialogue when it aired the very first time. My head nearly exploded. And at first I thought it was a problem with my TV, but I couldn't figure out how that could happen. I mean, in other words, how is it that the music is playing and the sound effects are playing, but the dialogue track isn't playing? And of course, it was a problem at the broadcast end.
Yeah, luckily, it was a broadcast end.
So the second time it aired, by the second time it was fixed, but the very first time it aired, we were getting, postings on message boards saying, I like that they tried this cool thing with no dialogue, but I'm not sure it really worked.
Very artistic choice.
Yeah, and we're like, no! I'm sorry, what were you
I was going to say, I thought you were talking about transmissions blowing out. But the color thing is, fixing that was like a nightmare because I didn't trust any of the monitors at the studio anymore. Yeah. Even with the monitor where we were supposed to watch the last thing before it went, and they had this one monitor on a cart that they would roll around all the color stylists to plug it in. It was very jerry-rigged.
Yeah, there was literally only one monitor in all of Sony that we were allowed to trust. So they would put it on a cart and wheel it from place to place while they were getting all the other monitors calibrated. And it was infuriating. And we would go down to the machine room to watch the final version. It was like
second season, I think I was like in my office for like maybe 5 minutes a day. I was always in the post room, because we had first and second season happening at the same time because of this color issue. And now you guys know about it because we're talking about it, but no one knew about it when it aired because we fixed it.
Yeah. Do you have any plans to incorporate the broader Marvel universe? And if so, was that?
I remember we talked about wanting to do that when we started, but there were all these rules about not using
the original plan was this was really, even though it was 2008, it was like 1963 redone as 2008. And so the original plan was that the Fantastic Four existed in the Baxter Building, but they were off fighting big cosmic problems. But this was before Don Blake found the hammer. This was before Tony Stark, took the shrapnel to his heart. The Hulk was like a myth out in the Southwest United States that people talked about, but no one was sure if he really existed. Ant-Man was out there. Captain America was still frozen in ice. So the idea was that slowly we'd start to bring these things in. And the first crossover I wanted to do was with the Human Torch, because if you read the old comics, Johnny Storm and Spider-Man had a really interesting relationship, and so I wanted to bring him in. I wanted Johnny to show up at Flash Thompson's party and all this stuff, and they were like, no. Fantastic Four, you can't use anything from Fantastic Four. And then the other thing was Kingpin they wouldn't let us use, because even though Kingpin was originally a Spider-Man villain, he'd become part of the Daredevil license, and so we couldn't use Kingpin, which was why, and I don't regret this because he turned out to be a great villain, but it's why we wound up using Tombstone, because originally that would have been the Kingpin thing. And then slowly, I never wanted it to be a team-up show. Like every episode, he was teaming up with a different Marvel hero. But slowly over time, I wanted to do that great Ditko story where the Hulk shows up. I wanted to do an Ant-Man and the Wasp story. I wanted to do this thing where you go up to the attic of the Parker home and all of Uncle Ben. When Uncle Ben was a kid during World War II, he was a huge Captain America fan, and so when Captain America does show up and is freed from the ice, that Spidey would really want to meet him because Uncle Ben was such a huge Captain America fan. And so the idea was like once a year we might do a crossover. I had an idea for an X-Men story, really early days of X-Men, where Professor X was just starting to gather the first students at his school, and the only two he's gathered are Beast and Cyclops. And they think that maybe Spider-Man is a mutant, so they try to meet him. So little things like that we talked about doing. And then very early on, it became clear that no, we were limited to the Spider-Man corner of the Marvel Universe, and we couldn't bring any of those other characters in. So that all fell by the wayside, but it would have been really cool if we could have. So we're 15 minutes over time here. I want to thank everybody for coming. Hope you enjoyed it. We're signing Spider-Man posters. We've got the 10th anniversary poster, but if you're in the mood, we also are selling the 10th anniversary poster that you got at the convention. That's free, obviously, and our signatures are free. But we're selling vintage Spectacular Spider-Man posters from 10 years ago. And I also have I think a couple actual animation scripts from Spectacular Spider-Man that I'm also selling. So if you guys are interested in those, stop by our tables. We'll be there in 5-10 minutes or so.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
$20. 20, I think that.